When we examine racism, we are often trained to look for isolated events. We look for broken policies, individual moral failings, or historical accidents. But diagnosing systemic dominance requires discarding that view entirely. Drawing on the intellectual framework of Neely Fuller Jr., we must recognize white supremacy as an intentional, totalizing architecture of power, engineered by human design. This architectural blueprint illustrates how that power is structured. The system operates across 9 domains of human activity, categorized under 3 primary pillars. To deconstruct this machine, we must evaluate it using a tri-lens methodology, passing 3 analytical filters over the structure. First, the sociological lens. This examines the structural mechanics, how resources are hoarded, and how power is institutionalized across generations. Second, the psychological lens. This reveals the system's internal conditioning, observing how it shapes the dominant mind towards superiority and the marginalized mind towards compliance. Finally, the theological lens. This exposes how imperial power manufactures a false sense of divine right, claiming moral legitimacy to justify its domination. Because this totalizing system is a constructed machine, mapping its detailed blueprints is the absolute prerequisite for dismantling it. The foundational tier of this architecture is governance. Through economics, law, and politics, this tier establishes the initial social hierarchy, allocates the wealth, and writes the rules of the game. Applying the sociological lens to law reveals a legal framework designed explicitly to protect property over people. It institutionalizes racial lines by making systemic deprivation legal and defining resistance as criminal. The law serves as the primary battleground for these property lines, requiring sustained legal friction to secure equal rights, as seen in the historic Supreme Court battles over public school segregation. Psychologically, living under this legal framework demands constant hypervigilance. The system subjects marginalized groups to constant state surveillance, conditioning society to associate those identities with criminality. In the domain of politics, this control is maintained through disenfranchisement. The system deliberately excludes marginalized voices from policymaking spaces to ensure the dominant group retains decision-making power, regardless of demographic shifts. Overcoming that exclusion requires collective political mobilization. The historical fight to secure voting rights is a direct confrontation with a governance structure engineered to suppress that exact agency. The theological lens clarifies how this control is justified. Political dominion is often framed as a divine mandate to rule over quote-unquote lesser populations for their own protection. Governance secures the wealth and writes the laws. But relying solely on raw force to maintain those laws is highly inefficient. The system requires a secondary structure to train the population to accept the hierarchy. This brings us to the middle tier, social structure. Comprising education, labor, and religion, this layer runs the machine. Sociologically, this tier acts as a sorting mechanism. It socializes and trains human beings, colonizing the mind and spirit to naturalize artificial inequality. Look at education through the concept of epistemology, the study of knowledge itself. Eurocentric curricula are designed to systematically distort or erase non-Western historical intellect, establishing a single cultural standard for intelligence. Early scholars mapped this systemic erasure in detail. Foundational texts by thinkers like Carter G. Woodson exposed how marginalized groups are actively miseducated to serve the dominant structure. The psychological impact of this miseducation is severe. It imprints double consciousness, feelings of intellectual inadequacy, and internalized oppression directly onto students of color. We see a similar stratification in labor. Sociologically, the market is segmented to extract maximum physical productivity from marginalized bodies, while reserving capital ownership and managerial authority for the dominant class.
Psychologically, this creates profound dissonance. Society relies heavily on essential physical labor, yet simultaneously devalues the human beings performing it, reducing their worth entirely to their economic output. Religion sits as the final piece of the social structure. Applying the theological lens reveals that mainstream imperial religion acts as the ultimate institutional glue. Co-opted faith weaponizes concepts of otherworldly salvation to encourage the passive acceptance of earthly poverty, dictating moral norms while shielding real-world structural oppressors from accountability. Together, education, labor, and religion convince the oppressed that their social position is natural and inevitable, effectively preventing organic rebellion before it starts. The outer shell of the architecture is social control. This encompasses entertainment, sex, and war. This pillar operates as a trigger mechanism. When social structure fails to maintain total compliance, social control activates to enforce boundaries and crush resistance. Sociologically, entertainment serves as a narrative engine. It deploys curated imagery and stereotypes to normalize racial hierarchies, pacify social discontent, and distract the populace from structural inequality. In the domain of sex, the psychological policing of bodies projects societal anxieties onto marginalized groups. Weaponizing sexual shame and controlling reproductive autonomy ruptures individual self-image and community solidarity. When narratives and policing fail, the system relies on war. State violence, militarized police forces, and global extraction act as the ultimate physical enforcement tools. The historical record is filled with instances where organized paramilitary violence was deployed during eras of racial tension to forcibly reestablish the dominant hierarchy. Imperial theology immediately steps in to legitimize this violence, framing state conquest as righteous missions or manifest destiny, hiding human tyranny behind a veil of false moral authority. Establishing rules, socializing minds, and deploying force, these three tiers create a self-defending system. It cannot be dismantled by accident. Confronting the totalizing scale of this architecture carries an overwhelming psychological weight. It is engineered to induce despair. But the counter-philosophy is clear. As Steve Biko articulated, the most potent weapon in the hands of the oppressor is the mind of the oppressed. Because this architecture was engineered entirely by human design, we must remember that it is highly vulnerable to human deconstruction. This flowchart outlines the genealogies of liberation, a three-step blueprint to dismantle the machine. Step 1 begins with vocabulary, using a diagnostic code to identify where systemic confusion operates, eliminating speech that allows the hierarchy to continue. Naming the specific domains of the system strips away its invisibility and neutralizes its false moral authority. Step 2 requires institutional decolonization. Pioneered by the Association of Black Psychologists in 1968, this step severs ties with Eurocentric psychological models. Restoring a centered spiritual and psychological consciousness provides the foundation for independent institution building. Step 3, formalized by Dr. Amos Wilson, demands that this mental liberation translate into a concrete political economy. It dictates specific operational necessities, pulling wealth from the dominant structure, converting it to independent credit unions, autonomous educational pipelines, and political action committees. Historically, establishing this level of autonomous power has required marginalized groups to carefully organize and physically protect those reallocated resources. Liberation requires a systematic reallocation of resources, shifting from reforming the machine to building something autonomous. By reclaiming knowledge, demanding dignity in labor, and maintaining moral clarity, the architecture crumbles, clearing space to build a foundation rooted entirely in justice.